Good morning. We would like to welcome you to the RFI webinar that's being hosted today, and to let you know that we have slides that will walk you through a lot of elements that you may want to know more about related to this request for information. My name is Hilda Rosselli, and I serve as the Policy Director for Educator Advancement at the Chief Education Office. I'm hosting this webinar on behalf of the Educator Advancement Council, and I'm joined by my colleague, Cheryl Myers, Transition Director for the Educator Advancement Council. Just as a reminder for those participating live today, these tips will help maximize your participation this morning. An archived taped version of the RFI webinar will be posted on the ORPN website, as well as on the Educator Advancement Council website. We are very interested in your questions, which will be used to develop a frequently asked question document for this RFI and will be posted on ORPN. This webinar is designed specifically for individuals and groups interested in learning more about and responding to the request for information on educator networks issued on October 11th, 2018 in ORPN. This RFI is among the initial steps the Educator Advancement Council is taking to establish educator networks for the purposes of dispersing the Educator Advancement Fund. The EAC, which is our shorthand for Educator Advancement Council, is seeking input from organizations who may already be involved in an educator network or those who have an interest in creating an educator network. So first, let's define a network. For the purposes of this RFI, networks are designed with a shared belief and understanding that systems need improving to sustain lasting change and impact, and that support will be provided to networks where tools, processes, and practices may be needed. In recognition of the various stages that networks may be currently at, we offer the following definitions for an existing network, an emerging network, or a potential/new network. So why is there an urgent opportunity awaiting you to respond to this RFI? First of all, the research is very clear around the importance of educators as the first responders to all student needs in the school. They spend the most time with students and often are the very first individuals who care about that relationship that is created in the classroom and is sustained during a year. We also know that those same educators and the school leaders that they work with require time and resources and support to be able to create the right environment for a student-centered, culturally responsive environment that's tailored to the student needs. I'm pausing here because it appears we have a difficulty with individuals viewing the slides. If you were on earlier, you may want to log out and log back in, as we had a practice webinar up earlier that may be causing one of the difficulties. So hopefully everyone is back with us. We are looking at slide number 6, which is why this is an urgent opportunity. We also want to emphasize that this effort is in conjunction with leaders and staff from all of the state education agencies that touch the lives of educators. And the part of this opportunity that exists is to create more alignment between systems that support educators in pre-K as well as K-12 settings. Lastly, we know that to date, the resources that have been set aside for supporting educators have been sporadic, sometimes inequitably accessible, and certainly not sufficient to meet all needs in the state. And so we look for ways in which we will be leveraging those resources. Let's look at a little bit of background information that may be helpful for you. Following legislation passed in 2013, the state has offered competitive grants over the past 3 biennium that have been very supportive of various initiatives touching the lives of educators. Many of you are aware of the Oregon Mentor Project or school district collaboration grants or Leading for Learning. These are just a few of the initiatives that we have outlined on this next slide. As you look at this particular diagram, please note first the chevron at the top of the slide. This represents what we call a career continuum, meaning that there are many places which these resources can help improve the supports for educators as they move through from beginning to think about a career in education all the way through to their own leadership and career advancement. One of the ways we would urge you to look at this slide is to realize that each of the rows represents a biennium with detailed information about investments that have been made available through the Network for Quality Teaching and Learning. As you look across, you'll see that there was an intentional effort made to plant resources at various stages along this continuum to support our educators. However, as we studied this process, we realized that there were goals that we could set for improving the system. The first one around equitable access to the resources. We want to ensure that all Oregon school districts receive state funding, not just the 50% who have received funding through the network. We also want to make sure that the number of novice educators, both teachers and administrators, that can have opportunities to be mentored and supported in their new careers increases beyond the current levels of service. We also realize that all areas of the state have the right and need for access to culturally responsive professional learning and leadership development opportunities. And lastly, we know that we must intentionally leverage the available resources with other types of partnerships, federal, state, and private partnership funds that can be used to enhance the work of the current network. We also are considering the context of Oregon's current educator workforce needs. And we see that we still have a very persistent gap between the racial linguistic diversity of our student populations and of our workforce, our educator workforce. With that, we recognize the needs of many rural communities who are finding it challenging to recruit and retain educators in particularly specific content areas and levels of education, including pre-K. And lastly, we are concerned about an attrition pattern for our educators, particularly new educators, that averages around 50%, depending on how we look at the grade levels or the demographics of our educators. We know that these are unsatisfactory markers for our work in supporting Oregon's educator workforce. We also have been listening to the field in the variety of settings in which we have engaged with practitioners. We want to call out the importance of teacher voice and local community context in shaping the needs for the use of these resources. We also want to move from one size fits all to solutions or approaches that are focused on systems and that can allow us to consider those local contexts that often are overlooked in a one-size-fits-all approach. And we know that culturally responsive professional learning must be available to all educators. We use the TEL results to also begin to better understand what are the perceptions of our school-based educators. And we would call out several areas. We know that there are areas of satisfaction with professional learning based on the 2018 results, which hover between 46% and 71%. And we know that is not yet satisfactory. We hear from educators in the 2018 TEL survey that for some who have had no access to any supports for them as novice educators, that there are a percentage considering leaving the field. And we know that we can improve that and help retain our novice educators. And lastly, we note that in the 2018 TEL survey results, every factor related to students' social and emotional needs were marked as lower in terms of educators' perception of satisfaction of their ability and resources to serve and support those student learning needs. In 2016, Governor Kate Brown, in recognizing some of the concerns that were raised from the network started in 2013, issued an executive order requesting that a council bring her recommendations on a coherent, transparent, and accountable governance models for the programs and practices that were outlined in the network and the associated fund. Those council members met for over a year and developed 10 recommendations that were released in this report in November 2016. We highly encourage all participants to download this report and read it thoroughly as good background information for this RFI. One of those recommendations in the report was to create an Educator Advancement Council that would coordinate and connect regional networks that supported professional learning priorities, blended funding sources, and elevated educator voice and leadership. This backbone helps fulfill some of the desired functions that we have for coordination, alignment, accountability, and quality assurances across the network. When this Educator Advancement Council was formed in 2018, the majority of the 23 members were drawn from educators who work in school districts, tribes, early learning services, and then looking at our educator service districts, higher education, philanthropy, and agency heads from the Oregon Department of Education, Early Learning Division, Teacher Standards and Practices Commission, and the Chief Education Office. The role of the EAC is to make recommendations to the Oregon Legislature on the most effective use of resources that can support and strengthen the education profession and ultimately provide the quality education that all students deserve. Let's take a closer look at a vision around educator networks that will help guide your responses and the ability to share examples with the Educator Advancement Council. The Educator Advancement Council seeks to create educator networks that will work throughout the state in engaging those educators and their communities in identifying local needs, leveraging resources and partnerships, and using the Educator Advancement Fund to support educators. In order to do that, the Educator Advancement Council is interested in learning more about existing, emerging, or potential networks and sponsors throughout the state in order to identify what their needs may be, their desired vision for networks, and the gaps that may still exist geographically in terms of access across the entire state. We have defined effective networks as those that focus on system improvement and sustained changes. By doing that, they better expand and leverage their current local community and partner resources, both financial and human assets, that can be brought to bear to support educators and professional learning. These systems approach their work with focused attention on continuous learning and improvement designed by educators and shared via networks. We believe that each network will have a responsibility for identifying the priorities of educators in their schools and school districts that will be served by the network, and building in attention to the local needs. We want to make sure that access is more equitable across the state, that there are not pockets of geography that are unable to provide resources for their local educators. And we will commit to the coordination of communication and accountability across networks and with the EAC. As we look for additional funds and resources, those will be shared with all of the networks across the state. So looking at some of the data that we gathered in a study of some existing networks, we found some common characteristics that correlate with effectiveness, readiness to examine data and to pay attention to how those data both reflect student outcomes and teaching and working conditions for educators will be a very important first step of an effective network. We also, as has been mentioned, will be paying attention to how the local context is considered, how an equity lens is brought to bear on all decision-making relative to networks, and how goals are prioritized with educator voice and impact paid attention to, with the opportunity to test potential changes in rapid cycles of improvement and identify outcomes and success while monitoring and learning how we can best adjust and fine-tune aspects of the networks to improve student learning outcomes. We also commit to sharing network design workshops that will be available to all individual responses to the RFI, and to provide a deepened understanding of the attributes and conditions that we've learned about in studying effective networks. This will help develop organizational capacity and alignment of the work throughout the state, and it will also give us a better understanding of how we can continue to provide tools and processes for users in this RFI proposal process. We envision that the logistics for these network design workshops will provide background and important historical context on the history of the EAC, the network investments to date, the educator continuum, as well as building tools that will provide support for recruitment and networking. We'll look at what the network focus areas are within a system and what the role of teacher voice will be, and how to carefully focus on systems rather than jumping to solutionitis. We envision that all networks will have a sponsoring organization whose responsibility it will be to coordinate ways in bringing participants from each network together and supporting them as they identify their needs and managing the funds that come from the legislature. So they will be serving as fiscal agents. We envision that these sponsoring organizations may support a place-based region of the state, or they may be location neutral. Either way, we are interested in hearing from those groups that have work underway or are envisioning networks that could address these needs. We believe that the bill is quite clear that school districts, and that would be Senate Bill 182, is clear on the fact that school districts, education service districts, and post-secondary institutions can be members of a network, but only they can serve as the fiscal agent of a network. So let's talk a little bit about the role of the Educator Advancement Council. They will be providing the recommendations that come out of an RFP, which I'll talk about shortly, to the legislature during the 2019 session. Following the conclusion of each legislative session going forward, there will be an iterative process where funds are dispersed and attention is paid to the ongoing needs every 2 years to provide new guidance to the legislature on best uses for the Educator Advancement Council. So now it's time to talk in more depth about the request for information, which I'll refer to as an RFI. We would like to be clear in distinguishing the difference between an RFI and what many individuals may have referenced as a RFP, or a request for proposal. An RFI is allowable use of a process to solicit information and aid us in decision making about a subsequent request for proposal. So responses to the RFI will not result in a contract in any way, but will gather information that will be used by the EAC in developing a subsequent request for proposal. That request for proposal will be a written formal solicitation process where price and specification are not the only consideration in determining award criteria. We will look at this as a means of distributing the resources of the Educator Advancement Fund starting in the school year of 2019 in a more equitable way, covering all aspects of the state. So you may be asking yourself, why do I need to compete in an RFI? Complete an RFI, not compete. We want you to be aware that the EAC will use the information received and analyze those data and information to develop that formal request for proposal this spring. We'll also be looking at responses to a series of questions in the RFI and beginning to note where we have gaps and needs that are addressed across the state to help us design the RFP. We would call to your attention that at the end of this webinar slide deck and in the RFI, there is a glossary of terms that will be very useful for you as you respond. So who should respond to the RFI? Given what we earlier shared about sponsoring organizations, we see that a number of partners and entities may be working in consortiums together. These may include education service districts, school districts, early learning providers, federally recognized tribes, our post-secondary partners, nonprofit organizations, community-based organizations, and of course, the combination of those entities working in consortium to best approach the needs of a local area. It will be important for you to pay attention to where you can access the RFI. We believe that some of you may have already received notices of that through ORPN. When you log into ORPN, you will need to register. That is available at no charge, and you'll be able to search for this particular RFI under ODE 1125-18. Please note that you will be able to be guided in your response to the RFI, and we will be able to answer additional questions that emerge even following this webinar, so that an updated frequently asked questions document can be posted to ORPN. You will be submitting your RFI response not to the Educator Advancement Council, but to our colleague who is operating this particular RFI through procurement offices in the Oregon Department of Education. So your file with the completed document will be sent to Jana Hart. You may also submit a hard copy at the address that is posted on the RFI cover page. This next slide shows you some key timelines that we'll review for you here. As you can see, the RFI was issued last week. Today, we are hosting the live informational webinar and answering questions as they emerge. And then we will make an archived copy of the webinar available by tomorrow, no later than close of day. We also envision that there will be some iterative processes around pre-response questions that you will be able to post to add to an FAQ, frequently asked questions document. And then we will anticipate that RFI responses, the attachment B, will be submitted by 5 p.m. on November 13th. We anticipate you may have questions about the RFI, and there are clear directions on this slide of how to submit your questions and to label your email so that Jana is able to provide clarifying information and publish your questions as needed to an ongoing list that will be posted on the ORPN site and for the Educator Advancement site. As I mentioned earlier, we believe that terminology is critical in this process, and a common understanding of terms that we use in the RFI will assist individuals or entities who are submitting an RFI. Please note that educators in this case refers to preschool and K-12 teachers, administrators, principals, assistant principals, and other professionals and administrators responsible for managing schools and working with students through daily instructional practices. We use the term teachers to refer to those who are licensed, credentialed educators serving in classrooms or in aspects of center-based preschools or K-12 schools. And we distinguish preschool as family childcare or early learning center-based program staff serving children between the ages of 0 and 5. Professional learning is a term that the Educator Advancement Council and the previous Governor's Council studied in depth, and they are using this in lieu of the term professional development to emphasize what we have learned through the literature on highly effective and impactful professional learning, characterized by professional learning that is sustained, collaborative, job-embedded, data-driven, and very classroom-focused. These provide some examples around how professional learning is paired with time that's necessary for transferring learning from professional learning into practice. We also call out the need for culturally responsive professional learning and development that explores and honors and sustains the assets that students bring to schools, whether that be linguistic, literate, or cultural pluralism of the students and their families in our state of Oregon. We also define here the difference between sponsoring organizations and fiscal agents, and note that this will be important for your understanding of how to complete the RFI. We also, as a teaser for some of the workshop design institutes that will be offered to all RFI responders, we want to just call out the importance of cycles or systems of continuous improvement and the nature with which we anticipate that networks will continue to refine and improve their work through rapid cycles of improvement and input using empathy data and user practitioner guidelines. This brings us to an opportunity now to answer queries that you have regarding this RFI. So I'm going to read the question, and for those questions that we would want to bring back to the EAC or to follow up with feedback, we will indicate that, but I will attempt to answer many of these questions live today. First question is, if this is a systems approach, what is the role of higher education in these networks if the focus is PK-12? This is an excellent question, and we've already seen what occurs when we have our higher ed partners focused on the work of K-12 in partnership. So this may be relationships that have been working or are designed to improve pathways for educators, since our higher education institutions are clearly the front runners in reaching a pool of candidates, recruiting, admitting, and preparing them in licensure programs. But we recognize that across the state, we have examples of strong, robust partnerships that have developed around a need to develop these systems together. We also know that professional learning is a responsibility of not only the school districts, the ESDs, and agencies that are charged with responsibility for professional learning, but quite often our higher education partners are developing coursework and technical assistance and working through grants and other means to provide high quality, timely professional learning to our school users. We also know that we have already created some systems that engage our higher ed partners. For example, in light of the growing gap between the diversity of our teacher candidates and our K-12, pre-K-12 student populations, we've instituted this year a program called the Oregon Teacher Scholars Program. And this is available through the Oregon Student Access and Completion entity of the Higher Ed Coordinating Commission to provide scholarships to students enrolled in higher education approved licensure programs in Oregon. So that's another example of how higher ed partners are working together. The next question asks, does the EAC approach also include informal out-of-school educators who often provide critical academic and social emotional support for marginalized students? The EAC believes that the local context should drive the answer to this question and should be players at the table in developing a response around the highest level of needs and resources to support educators. I'm going to wait a moment to see if we have any additional questions that emerge from our audience. We've had a question requesting that I speak more to what a statewide network might look like. I think that the importance of an RFI is behind the answer to this question. If we felt as though the EAC had a predetermined answer to that question, we would have probably moved to a request for proposal right away. However, using a request for information allows the field to give us answers around what they see as already in place in their area, or to actually envision new systems as they emerge. However, I will call out, we do have one example of a statewide organization that has developed a network of supporting groups of educators across the state focused on improving the use of formative assessment in the classroom. And so this is an example of a network that is focused on a common area of practice and is connecting educators across the state. The next question that has emerged is, can a network have a content focus? Science or math are examples that are offered here. Once again, we envision that a systems approach is critical in looking across the entire continuum of an educator's career in education. So if, for example, there is a great need for enhancing the pedagogy of teachers in science and math to be most effective with student learning, that may also need to be a systems look at how do we prepare the educators going into science and math, and how are we supporting teacher leaders to emerge and provide guidance for other educators around pedagogy. So again, we don't see this as an isolated one piece of a system, but rather looking across an entire spectrum. I'll wait for a moment longer to see if we have any additional questions emerged. And we encourage you, of course, to read the RFI carefully and then to send any additional questions to Jana. The slide reminds you of how to send your questions and to indicate in the subject line of your email this particular title. Not seeing any additional questions, I want to again thank you for your interest and involvement in today's webinar, and to assure you that we are really looking forward to your participation in this RFI. Thank you so much for your time today, and best wishes for the rest of the week. We look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.